You were my wife, but tonight you embarrassed me.
No, Richard. Tonight you finally showed everyone who you are.
What are you hiding?
You'll find out soon.
The chandeliers above the ballroom threw down a light so golden it made every diamond in the room look like it was on fire. And 300 of Manhattan's wealthiest were raising their glasses to a man who had built himself out of nothing but ambition and hunger. Richard Callahan stood at the center of it all, tall, polished, his tuxedo cut sharp enough to command a room without him saying a word, though tonight he had plenty of words. The string quartet had just finished a piece. The applause was still settling, and Richard lifted his glass higher, his voice booming with the kind of confidence that only comes from a man who has never once imagined the ground beneath him could crack. He was thanking his investors, thanking his mother seated at the front table in pearls that cost more than most people's homes, thanking the city of New York itself for making room for a boy from nothing to become a name everyone in that room now feared and admired in equal measure. And then he saw her, standing in the kitchen doorway at the far end of the ballroom, still in her black uniform, a white apron tied at her waist, a tray balanced in her hands like she had simply forgotten to set it down before stepping into view. Her name was Elle, and for one suspended moment, Richard's toast lost its rhythm. The room noticed the pause before they noticed her. 300 faces turned in the direction of his gaze, and what they found was a woman who did not belong in a ballroom like this, not by the standards these people had built their entire lives around. Richard's jaw tightened. Something in him, something small and cruel and terrified, decided in that instant that her presence was an insult to everything he had just spent 5 minutes bragging about. He set his glass down on the nearest table, hard enough that the crystal rang out, and the room went from murmuring to silent in the space of a single breath. He looked at Elle the way a man looks at a stain he suddenly notices on an expensive suit, and he said, loud enough for every corner of that ballroom to hear him clearly, that he had married the help by mistake. He said it like a confession he had been holding in his chest for months, like relief was finally washing over him now that the truth was out in the open. He told her to go back to the kitchen where she belonged, that this was not her world, that she had never belonged in it, and that everyone standing in that room could finally stop pretending otherwise alongside him. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your ears, the kind where you can hear champagne bubbles popping in glasses because no one dares to breathe too loud. Waiters froze mid-step. A woman near the bar covered her mouth with her hand. Richard's own mother, Margaret, sitting close enough to see everything, did not move, did not speak, her expression unreadable in a way that would matter far more later than it did in that moment. Every eye in the ballroom shifted from Richard to Elle, waiting for tears, waiting for her to shrink, waiting for the humiliation to land the way these things usually land on people who have spent their whole lives being underestimated. But Elle did not cry. She did not drop the tray, did not stumble backward, did not give the room the reaction it was hungry for. Her face went still, unervingly calm, the kind of calm that unsettles people more than screaming ever could. She looked at Richard for a long moment, the tray still steady in her hands, and something passed behind her eyes that no one in that room, including her own husband, was equipped to read correctly. It was not the look of a woman who had just lost everything. It was the look of a woman who understood, in that exact second, precisely what she was going to do next. She set the tray down slowly on the nearest table, turned, and walked out of that ballroom without a single word, her heels echoing against the marble floor in a rhythm that felt more like a countdown than a retreat. The doors closed behind her, and Richard Callahan stood there in front of 300 witnesses to his own cruelty, still holding on to the applause he thought this night was going to end with. He had no idea, not yet, that the woman he had just called to help owned more of the city outside those windows than every person clapping for him combined. He had no idea that her real name carried weight in boardrooms he had never been invited into. And he had no idea that the woman he just humiliated in front of everyone he wanted to impress was about to walk back into his life and take away everything he thought made him powerful. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story you just watched unfold inside that ballroom did not begin with silk tablecloths or crystal chandeliers. It began 8 months earlier, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Newark, where a woman named Elle Hayes woke up before the sun every single morning to start a life that no one in that ballroom could have imagined. She rose at 4:30, made coffee in a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, and looked in on her younger sister Sophia, still asleep on the pull-out couch they had shared since their mother passed. Elle worked as a housekeeper for one of the city's most talked-about real estate developers, a job she had taken not out of desperation but out of a need to disappear, to be invisible in a world that had once expected everything from her and given her nothing but grief in return. She had a routine so precise you could set a clock by it. She cleaned Richard Callahan's penthouse 3 times a week, always before he woke, moving through the rooms like a ghost who left no trace behind except the faint scent of lemon polish and clean linen. She never touched his papers, never lingered near his phone, never gave him a single reason to notice her beyond the spotless condition of his home. But competence has a way of announcing itself even when a person is trying their hardest to stay unseen. She corrected small errors she found lying around, a misfiled contract here, a scheduling conflict there, always quietly, always without claiming credit, because claiming credit meant being seen, and being seen was the last thing Elle Hayes wanted from this life she had built for herself in hiding. At home, she carried a different weight entirely. Sophia was in her final year of nursing school, brilliant and exhausted in equal measure, and Elle had made it her mission to make sure her sister never had to choose between an education and eating a proper meal. Twice a month, Elle took the train out to a modest care facility in Trenton to visit their grandfather, Thomas Hayes, a man whose hands had built something enormous once, though Elle rarely spoke of it, not even to Sophia. In his room, surrounded by machines that beeped softly through every visit, Thomas would hold her hand and ask her the same question nearly every time she came. He would ask her when she was finally going to stop hiding from who she really was. Elle always changed the subject. She would tell him about Sophia's grades, about the weather, about anything that kept the conversation away from the one truth she had spent years running from. Tucked inside her coat pocket, unopened for months at a time, were letters bearing a return address that read Hayes Maritime Holdings, a name that meant nothing to the people she cleaned houses for and everything to the people who had once expected her to inherit it. She had walked away from that world years earlier, after a bitter falling out with her father over how the company treated the very workers who built its fortune, and she had promised herself she would rather scrub another person's floors for the rest of her life than sit at the head of a table built on other people's suffering. The household ran on a particular rhythm that Naomi came to understand within her first year, one built around managing Marcus's moods rather than his schedule. Isabel Reyes, his executive assistant, functioned less like an employee and more like a translator, softening his demands before they reached other staff, absorbing his temper so it landed on her rather than anyone else. Isabel had worked for Marcus for 6 years by the time Naomi's own tenure reached its midpoint, and the two women developed a quiet understanding neither of them ever spoke aloud directly, an unspoken agreement that survival in that house meant noticing everything and reacting to almost nothing. It was Isabel who first mentioned, in passing, that something had been troubling Marcus in recent months, something involving numbers that did not add up the way they should have across 2 of his oldest development projects. That conversation happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, nearly 6 months before the gala, while Naomi was polishing silver in the pantry, and Isabel came in looking for a set of car keys that had gone missing from the front hall table. Isabel mentioned, almost as an aside, that Marcus had spent the entire morning on the phone with his accountant, his voice carrying through two closed doors, something about discrepancies in the books for the Riverside Commons development, a project completed nearly 15 years earlier under circumstances Naomi remembered better than anyone in that house could possibly have known. Isabel didn't think much of it at the time. Executives had bad mornings. Numbers occasionally didn't reconcile. But Naomi felt something tighten in her chest at the mention of that specific project, because Riverside Commons had not started as Marcus's development at all. It had started as her father's. Over the following weeks, Naomi began noticing small changes in the household that told her more than any overheard phone call could. Marcus started locking his study door during the day, something he had never bothered doing before. He met privately with his accountant twice as often, men in gray suits arriving early and leaving looking drained. He grew short-tempered with Simone over things that had nothing to do with money, snapping at her for rearranging flowers or scheduling dinner too late, the way people snap at those closest to them when the real source of their fear feels too large to name out loud. Naomi recognized the pattern immediately. She had watched her own father unravel in smaller, quieter ways once, decades earlier, when the walls of something he'd built started closing in around him. Watching Marcus experience even a shadow of that unraveling stirred something in her she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly. Something closer to recognition. The discrepancy, as Naomi eventually pieced together from fragments of conversation she was never meant to hear, involved an old audit trail connected to how ownership of Riverside Commons had originally transferred out of Bishop Construction and into Marcus's holdings all those years ago. A junior analyst at Marcus's accounting firm, reviewing records ahead of a routine refinancing, had flagged inconsistencies in the original transfer documentation, the same documentation Naomi's father had once signed in his own kitchen, trusting a young man who called him a partner. Marcus wasn't worried about losing the property itself. Riverside Commons had long since been folded into a larger portfolio worth exponentially more. He was worried about what a deeper audit might reveal about how he had acquired it, and about who might still be alive to remember the truth of what happened. Naomi did not go looking for any of this information. It arrived in pieces, the way most important truths arrive in a house full of people who assume the help cannot understand what they're overhearing. She never once considered using what she learned as leverage, not seriously, not in those early weeks. What she felt instead, standing in that pantry with a silver spoon still in her hand, was something quieter and far more dangerous to a man like Marcus than blackmail ever could have been. She felt patient. She had waited 11 years already. She could wait a little longer, if waiting meant the truth would finally surface on its own, in its own time, without her having to say a single word to force it into the light. Isabel noticed the shift in Naomi before Naomi herself fully registered that anything had changed. It was small things at first, the kind of details only someone trained to read a room for a living would catch. Naomi lingered a beat too long near Marcus's study door when he was on the phone. She asked, once, with studied casualness, whether the Riverside project had always belonged to the Whitfield family or whether Marcus had acquired it somewhere along the way. Isabel answered without thinking much of it, said something vague about Marcus building most of his early portfolio through acquisitions, and then caught the look that crossed Naomi's face for half a second before it disappeared behind the same calm expression she wore for everyone in that house. Isabel had spent 6 years learning to read Marcus. She was only beginning to realize she had spent almost as long failing to truly see the woman who cleaned his floors. Marcus's paranoia, meanwhile, had started curdling into something uglier than mere stress. He began questioning household staff about small missing items, a cufflink here, a pin there, objects that had likely simply been misplaced in a house with 30 rooms and a rotating cast of contractors and caterers moving through it for various events. He fixated on these losses with an intensity that had little to do with their actual value. Naomi understood. watching him corner a young server over a missing letter opener, that Marcus needed to feel in control of something while the ground shifted beneath the one thing he could not control at all, the slow, grinding progress of an audit trail closing in on a truth he had buried for over 2 decades. He started looking at his own staff the way a man looks at people he suspects might already know more about him than they should. It was Simone who unintentionally escalated things 3 weeks before the gala, during what should have been an unremarkable dinner conversation. She mentioned, lightly, that she'd run into an old family friend who asked whatever happened to that construction company Marcus used to talk about in his early speeches, the one with the founder's name Simone could never quite remember. Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He recovered quickly, made a joke about ancient history, but Naomi, clearing plates from the sideboard at that exact moment, saw something pass behind his eyes that she recognized instantly. Fear disguised as irritation. She had seen that same expression on her own father's face once, in reverse, standing in a courthouse hallway holding a piece of paper that had just taken everything from him. Now it belonged to the man who had taken it. 2 weeks before the anniversary gala, Marcus finally received the preliminary results of the internal audit he had been dreading. The analysts flagged inconsistencies were not, as he had hoped, simple clerical errors from 3 decades ago. They pointed, with increasing clarity, toward a documented history in which the original ownership transfer of what became Riverside Commons involved contract language that a court, viewed today with modern scrutiny, might well interpret very differently than a rush judge had interpreted it 26 years earlier. It would not undo anything automatically. It would not hand the property back to anyone. But it would, if it ever became public, attach a very different word to Marcus Whitfield's origin story than the one he had spent his career rehearsing in front of mirrors and journalists. The word was theft. And somewhere in that enormous house, a woman who had waited 11 years for exactly this moment continued dusting his mantle as though she knew nothing at all. The gala itself had been planned for nearly a year, an anniversary celebration marking 15 years of Marcus and Simone's marriage, though by that point the marriage itself had long since become more performance than partnership. Simone had thrown herself into the planning with an intensity that surprised even the household staff, choosing flowers, rehearsing toasts, commissioning an ice sculpture shaped like the Whitfield estate itself. Naomi watched her employer's wife pour herself into every detail of an event meant to celebrate a union that seemed, from the outside of that marble kitchen, increasingly hollow. She wondered sometimes whether Simone clung so tightly to the appearance of happiness because acknowledging otherwise would mean admitting how much of her own life she had quietly folded away to accommodate a man who required constant, uncomplicated admiration. Naomi understood that particular kind of folding better than anyone at that party would have guessed. Preparations for the gala brought nearly 3 times the usual staff into the house, caterers and florists, and a small orchestra rehearsing in the ballroom for 2 full days beforehand. Naomi found herself assigned to oversee several of the temporary staff, a responsibility that came with a small pay bonus she badly needed, since Denise's nursing program tuition had increased again that semester in a way neither of them had budgeted for. She moved through those final days with the same steady competence she brought to everything, checking place settings, coordinating with the catering company, making sure $500,000 worth of flowers arrived without a single wilted petal. Nobody watching her that week would have guessed she was carrying, quietly and without complaint, a truth large enough to unravel the entire event they were building toward. Marcus, in those final days before the party, grew increasingly erratic in ways that rippled through the household like static electricity. He fired a longtime gardener over a minor pruning disagreement, then rehired him 2 days later with an apology that fooled no one into thinking he had actually changed. He drank earlier in the day than usual, started conversations with his accountant that ended abruptly whenever staff entered the room, and snapped at Isabel twice in one afternoon over scheduling errors that, on any other week, would have barely registered as errors at all. Isabel began to suspect that the audit trouble ran deeper than Marcus had let on, though she still had no idea how deep, and certainly no idea that the woman polishing silver 2 rooms away held pieces of that same puzzle he was so desperately trying to keep buried. The night of the gala arrived unusually warm for the season, guests arriving in a steady stream of luxury vehicles that lined the circular driveway for nearly an hour before the event officially began. Naomi arrived early with the rest of the staff, dressed in the plain black uniform the catering company required, moving through final preparations with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent 11 years perfecting invisibility in rooms exactly like this one. She had no plan that evening to say anything at all. She fully intended, as she had every day for 6 months, to simply do her job, refill the water pitchers, clear the plates, and go home to her daughter with her secret still folded carefully in its usual place. Marcus Whitfield, drunk on champagne and unearned confidence, was about to make that intention impossible to keep. The first 2 hours of the gala unfolded exactly as Simone had planned them, a string quartet playing softly as guests arrived, waiters circulating with champagne, Marcus greeting business partners and old family friends with the practiced warmth of a man who had given hundreds of speeches about his own success. He moved through the ballroom shaking hands, accepting congratulations on 15 years of marriage, occasionally glancing towards Simone with an expression that might have passed for affection to anyone who hadn't watched the marriage hollow out slowly over more than a decade. Naomi worked the perimeter of the room with the other catering staff, refilling glasses, clearing appetizer plates, moving through the crowd the way she had learned to move through every room in that house, present enough to be useful and invisible enough to never be noticed. By the time the formal toast began, Marcus had already had considerably more champagne than the evening called for. He stood at the head table, glass raised, delivering a speech about resilience and vision that Naomi had heard rehearsed behind his study door weeks earlier, word for word, including the line about building an empire from nothing but grit and instinct. She had heard that particular lie so many times by now that it no longer even stirred much anger in her, only a tired, familiar ache, the same ache she imagined her father must have carried every time he saw Marcus's name attached to buildings that should have carried his own. The guests applauded warmly. Simone smiled from beside him, her expression practiced and slightly distant, the smile of a woman who had learned to perform happiness convincingly enough that most people stopped looking closely enough to notice the difference. It was during the lull after the toasts, while the orchestra shifted into something lighter and guests drifted toward the dessert tables, that Marcus's mood curdled without warning. He had spent the earlier part of the evening successfully avoiding thoughts of the audit, the accountant's warnings, the quiet dread that had been building in him for weeks. But alcohol has a way of loosening exactly the anxieties a person spends the most energy suppressing. He noticed Naomi near the dessert table, refilling a water pitcher for a table she hadn't technically been assigned to, and something in him, some combination of unease and cruelty and the particular arrogance of a man who has never once faced real consequences, decided this was the moment to perform confidence for a room full of people whose approval he still, after everything, desperately needed. He turned to a cluster of nearby guests and asked, loudly enough for a dozen tables to hear, whether the entertainment staff were permitted to sample the desserts before the guests got to them, gesturing toward Naomi with the particular carelessness of a man who had never once had to learn anyone's actual job title in his own house. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the closest tables, the kind of laughter people offer a powerful man out of reflex rather than genuine amusement. Naomi set the pitcher down slowly, deliberately, the way she always handled things when her hands wanted to shake and she refused to let them. She had absorbed smaller cruelties from Marcus Whitfield for 11 years without ever once raising her voice. She had no way of knowing yet that this particular evening, this particular cruelty, was about to be the last one she would ever choose to swallow in silence. Marcus, emboldened by the laughter and the champagne and whatever deeper anxiety was still gnawing at him from the audit he couldn't stop thinking about, decided the joke deserved an encore. He stepped closer to Naomi, swaying slightly, his voice carrying now across an even wider stretch of the ballroom as conversations nearby began quieting to listen. He told the gathering crowd that he'd noticed money missing from his study desk the previous week, a detail he had never actually mentioned to Naomi or any staff member before that exact moment, and wondered aloud, with theatrical mock seriousness, whether the household help had decided to help themselves to more than just the desserts. The laughter this time was thinner, more uncertain, several guests glancing at each other with the particular discomfort of people realizing a joke had curdled into something they no longer wanted to be part of. 50 conversations stopped at once, glasses lowered halfway to lips, and stayed there. Simone, standing near the head table, felt her stomach drop as she watched her husband's face, recognizing the specific, reckless energy he got whenever he needed an audience more than he needed dignity. Isabel, stationed near the entrance to keep track of arriving latecomers, turned sharply at the sudden hush, understanding immediately from years of experience exactly what kind of moment this had become. Naomi felt the weight of every eye in that ballroom land on her simultaneously, the particular, suffocating pressure of being accused publicly by a man who had employed her for over a decade and still, after all that time, could not have told anyone in that room her last name if his life depended on it. She had two choices in that instant, the same two choices that had shaped nearly every difficult moment of her adult life. She could lower her eyes, apologize for a theft she had not committed, and let the moment pass the way she had let 1,000 smaller moments pass before it, absorbing the humiliation quietly because quiet had always kept her employed, kept Denise in school, kept the lights on in an apartment neither of them could afford to lose. Or she could speak. For 11 years, silence had been the practical choice, the safer choice, the choice that protected everything she had left. But something had shifted in Naomi over the past 6 months that none of these 50 guests understood, something that had nothing to do with a missing letter opener or petty cash from a desk drawer, and everything to do with a truth about Riverside Commons that she had carried quietly for far longer than Marcus had spent building his empire on top of it. Naomi lifted her chin slowly, deliberately, the same way she had learned to lift it from a father who had once stood in a courthouse hallway and refused to let a dismissal notice break him completely, even as it took nearly everything else. The ballroom, still holding its collective breath, watched a woman who had spent 11 years being professionally invisible decide, in that exact moment, that invisibility had finally cost her enough. Her lips parted. Marcus, still riding the high of his own performance, had no idea that the woman he'd just accused of theft in front of 50 of his closest business associates was about to speak 5 words that would strip away everything he had spent 26 years building on a foundation that had never truly belonged to him. "You stole this from my father." The words landed in that ballroom like a held breath finally released, quiet enough that guests 2 tables back had to lean toward their neighbors to confirm what they'd just heard, and loud enough, in the sudden silence, that everyone within 20 feet heard it perfectly the first time. Marcus's smile did not fall all at once. It faltered first, the corners twitching in confusion, the particular expression of a man whose brain has not yet caught up to what his body already understands has just happened. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. 11 years of practiced calm carried those 5 words further than shouting ever could have, and something in her tone, steady and unhurried, told every person listening that this was not an accusation born of anger in the moment. This was a fact she had been holding, whole and unshaken, for a very long time. Simone's glass slipped slightly in her hand before she caught it. Isabel, still near the entrance, felt her stomach turn over as pieces she hadn't known were connected suddenly arranged themselves into a shape she should have recognized months earlier. Marcus opened his mouth, some reflexive denial already forming. The same practiced ease that had carried him through board meetings and press interviews for 2 decades. But nothing came out. His eyes moved over Naomi's face for the first time in 11 years, really moved over it, searching for something familiar, and whatever he found there stole the words directly out of his throat. A few guests began murmuring questions to each other. Someone near the head table asked aloud who her father was. Nobody moved to fill the silence Marcus had left hanging. Naomi did not wait for him to recover. She said her father's name clearly, the way she had wanted to say it in that house for 11 years and never once allowed herself to. Watching it register on Marcus's face like a blow landing seconds after the punch. Elijah Bishop, she told the room, in a voice that grew steadier with each sentence rather than shakier, that Riverside Commons had once belonged to Bishop Construction, that her father had built it with his own hands and his own crews, and that the man standing in front of them accepting congratulations for 15 years of marriage and decades of self-made success had taken it from him through a contract clause buried on page 11 that nobody had been meant to notice until it was already too late to matter. Marcus finally found his voice, thin and defensive, insisting this was ancient history, a business dispute settled decades ago through proper legal channels, his composure cracking at the edges even as he tried to reassert it. But Naomi was not finished, and this time it was Isabel who spoke next, stepping forward from the entrance with a folder she had been quietly compiling for weeks without fully understanding why, confirming in front of 50 stunned witnesses that the internal audit Marcus had spent a month trying to bury showed exactly the irregularities Naomi had just described. The ballroom that had gone silent for Marcus's cruelty now stayed silent for an entirely different reason, watching 2 women neither of them had ever truly seen before dismantle, piece by piece, the only story Marcus Whitfield had ever told about himself. Marcus stood frozen at the head table for what felt, to everyone watching, like an unnaturally long stretch of silence, though in reality it lasted only a handful of seconds. His face moved through several expressions in quick succession, confusion giving way to anger, anger giving way to something closer to panic as he registered just how many witnesses now stood between him and any version of this evening he could still control. He turned toward Isabel first, demanding to know what folder she was holding and why she had brought it to his own anniversary party, his voice climbing toward the register he used when he wanted people to remember who paid their salary. Isabel did not flinch the way she once might have. 6 years of absorbing his temper had taught her exactly how much weight his anger actually carried once an audience stopped being impressed by it. She told him, calmly, that the folder contained the preliminary audit findings his own accounting firm had flagged 3 weeks earlier, the same findings he had spent that entire time trying to keep from reaching the board, and that she had brought it tonight not to embarrass him, but because something in Naomi's earlier questions about Riverside Commons had made her uneasy enough to start looking closer at records she'd previously never had reason to question. She had not known, until this exact moment, that the woman asking those questions was the daughter of the man whose name had been quietly erased from every document tracing that property's history. Isabel's voice cracked slightly on that last part, the realization of what she had unknowingly been sitting on for weeks finally landing with its full weight. Guests near the head table began pulling out phones, some recording discreetly, others simply staring, unable to look away from a moment none of them had walked into that ballroom expecting to witness. A business partner Marcus had known for 15 years asked, quietly but audibly, whether any of what Naomi said was actually true, and Marcus's hesitation before answering told the room more than any denial could have. Simone rose slowly from her seat beside him, her expression unreadable, and for the first time in longer than either of them could probably calculate, she looked directly at her husband rather than performing the practiced warmth she usually reserved for public moments. She did not defend him. She did not immediately condemn him either. She simply looked, the way a person looks at someone they are seeing clearly for the very first time after years of choosing not to. Naomi, still standing near the dessert table where this had all begun, felt something unclench in her chest that had been tight for 11 years. Longer than that, really. Tight since a courthouse hallway decades earlier, when she had watched her father hold a piece of paper that took everything from him. She had not planned this moment. She had not walked into that ballroom that evening intending to say a single word about Riverside Commons, or her father's name, or any of it. But watching Marcus Whitfield stand exposed in front of the very people whose admiration he had built his entire identity around, she understood that some truths simply choose their own moment to surface, regardless of how carefully a person has tried to keep them buried, and regardless of how long they have waited quietly for justice that finally seemed within reach. Simone Whitfield's silence stretched long enough that several nearby guests began to shift uncomfortably, unsure whether the evening's entertainment had somehow become this instead, a marriage and an empire unraveling in real time under crystal chandeliers, meant to celebrate neither of those things ending. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the practiced warmth she'd used all evening greeting guests. She asked Marcus, simply, whether it was true, whether the company he had spent 15 years of their marriage describing as something he built entirely alone had actually belonged to someone else first. Someone whose daughter had been quietly cleaning their home for over a decade while he told that same lie to reporters, investors, and eventually to their own 2 children who idolized him. Marcus's answer, when it finally came, was not the outright denial the room seemed to expect. Something in him, some last fragment of the man he might have been before decades of unearned success calcified into arrogance, seemed to buckle under the accumulated weight of every eye still fixed on him. He said the deal with Elijah Bishop had been legal, that courts had reviewed it decades earlier and found nothing improper, that he had built plenty on his own even if the initial foundation had come from somewhere else. It was, in its own way, the closest thing to an admission he had ever made in public, and the ballroom seemed to register it as exactly that. A confession dressed up in legal language. The same trick he had used 26 years earlier to take a company from a man who trusted him.